So you want to know about the weirdest chapter in the entire Bible. Angels mating with humans, producing savage beasts called the Nephilim. Wait, what? Does it really say that? Let's investigate the mystery that is Genesis 6, 1 through 4, the intro to the flood story. The passage itself says, "When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown." Oh, that was intense. A little bit weird. I bet your Sunday school teacher did not mention that was the intro to the flood story. Mine didn't. The key question everyone asks is, who are the sons of God? There is a possible clue hidden in verses 1 and 2. There are 3 words here that might be familiar to you. Scholar Gordon J. Winham points out that the words saw, good, and took come from another story of the Bible. The translation of Genesis 6 that we read might say attractive instead of good, but in Hebrew, it comes from the same root word that means good. Saw, good, took. It's kind of a bit like caveman speak, but does that sound like any other story to you? Something else from Genesis, perhaps? The author of Genesis 6 was mapping this story on top of another story. Are you ready for it? Let me show it to you. Genesis 3, verse 6. "So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, she took of its fruit." Aha! Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is using language from Genesis 3, linking the 2 stories. The author is trying to make you think of the fall of Adam and Eve. Why would he do that? I think he's trying to tell you that the story of Adam and Eve taking forbidden fruit is the key that you need to understand Genesis 6. The writers of the Bible actually used strategies like this a lot, so be on the lookout for them whenever you read the Bible. So if we use this key, what do we learn? There's actually 2 possibilities. If the sons of God are human, what we have here is a repeat of the fall of Adam and Eve, just on a much larger scale. But if the sons of God are angels, then Genesis 6 is about the fall of the angels. Now they're in the position of Adam and Eve taking forbidden fruit in the form of human women. We still need more information to tell us whether or not the sons of God are human or angels. Which did the author of Genesis 6 actually mean? Well, one thing we could do to help us decide is trace these 2 interpretations backwards and see which one came first. The belief that they were angels is an old Jewish view called the Watcher tradition. In addition to this theory, there is a popular counter view to put on the table too, that this verse simply describes human men thought to be from the lineage of Adam and Eve's 3rd son Seth, marrying pagan wives. There's also another view that the sons of God meant human rulers, although that view has mostly fallen out of favor with most scholars. You'll see why in a few minutes. So in the Old Testament period, we only have 2 theories to this point. The sons of God are either angels or humans. Which one is it? Well, one of the oldest appearances of the phrase sons of God appears in the writings of Israel's Canaanite neighbors, a northern port city called Ugarit. Their text was called the Baal cycle, and it dates anywhere from 1500 BCE to 1300 BCE. And in it, the phrase sons of God referred to beings that are basically the equivalent of angels. They're the gods of their divine pantheon. After that comes a whole mix of biblical writings. Jewish writings from the Second Temple period, the Dead Sea Scrolls, you may have heard of those. a whole bunch of writings from the early Christian church fathers. So which writings support a human interpretation of the sons of God? We have 3 major documents in support of this view. Take a look at the dates. Notice there's nothing here from the Old Testament period. Isn't that interesting? It's worth noting that Israel was called God's son, an analogy in the book of Exodus chapter 4 verse 23. But most scholars don't think that's quite the same thing as the phrase we're looking for. Now let's take a look at the writings that spoke of the sons of God as angels. You'll certainly notice Job, the Old Testament book that describes the sons of God as angels, in chapters 1, 2, and 38. Here's a second page of writings from the early Christian church fathers. And here are some more. That is quite a list. Let's put them all on one chart in order of appearance and see what we learn. Uh-oh. It looks like the weird interpretation is at least 550, maybe 1,000, maybe more years older than the human interpretation. What does that mean? Wait, what's wrong? No, you don't have to stop reading your Bible. It's not that bad. No evil angels are coming to get you. As long as you don't try astral projection. As I was saying, I know it's weird, but let me propose a logical way to look at this. If you believe God exists, then by association you believe in a spiritual realm, right? Well, that means that you believe 2 worlds exist. One physical and one spiritual. Well, if there is a spiritual realm, it makes sense that God's not living there alone, right? Like, he probably made some angels citizens of the spiritual realm. And we know that God sometimes interacts with our physical world. The biblical story says that sometimes God sends angels to cross over into our world. Biblically speaking, sometimes the angels manifested physically and passed for humans. They ate meals with people. People didn't realize they were from another realm until they just up and disappeared. Doesn't it seem plausible then that some disgruntled angels, beings similar to Satan perhaps, might also try to cross over into the physical world too? That is what Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is about. Some believe someone inserted Genesis 6, 1 through 4 into the Bible to make it congruent with the Enoch story, that weird story about angels mating with humans. But scholar Archie T. Wright says as much as he wants to embrace that theory, it has no textual evidence. Therefore, until he gets that, he cannot embrace that view. So what happened? Wright and other scholars note that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai actively campaigned against the angel interpretation. In his opinion, it was a heresy. So he said that anyone who translated Genesis 6 to include the phrase, sons of God, they would be cursed. And so a new translation emerged. Instead of sons of God, some Bibles today still say sons of rulers. And in other passages, instead of sons of God, it says sons of Israel. The majority of modern scholars now know that these translations are incorrect, but not all Bibles have updated yet. So check your Bible and see what it says. Now there is one more view to throw on the table. That's Philo of Alexandria. Now he had sort of a hybrid view. He lived during Jesus' lifetime and a little bit after. He thought the sons of God were angels, but they were souls that descended to earth and became human, where they were then overcome by the passions of the flesh. So it's sort of a hybrid between the two views. But in this theology, it seems the Nephilim giants were a metaphor for lust and the lusts of the flesh. Some scholars will argue that Philo's view was influential moving forward, while other scholars such as David Runia will say that Philo's views were either rejected or ignored by the Jews. He obviously had kind of his own ideas. Scholars also debate as to whether or not Philo was even aware of the Watcher tradition, so maybe that accounts for why his views are a little bit different. It seems possible that Philo's writings, called De Gigantes, marks the point in time when the story about the sons of God evolved from something thought to be historical into an allegory. It is an interesting take. So if you choose to view the intro of the flood story as an allegory, then the question you'll want to ask is, what truth is this allegory trying to tell us? What are we supposed to learn from this? A final question for Christians who are uncomfortable with the angel theory. Is this theory really any weirder than the virgin conception of Jesus? If you think about it, it's almost the same thing. Almost. Jesus' birth could be looked at as God's answer to the events in Genesis 6:1-4. The Nephilim could also be looked at as Antichrist figures, born in a similar way, fathered by a spirit from the spiritual realm. It's worth considering. So there you have it. There are three views. One, that the sons of God are humans, human descendants of Seth. Another view, that the sons of God are angels or fallen angels. And third, the sons of God are angels that became human, that were then overcome by lust. Only you can decide what you believe about this. It might seem like just one weird passage, but your decision here will affect your interpretation of the rest of the Bible, including the flood story, who Israel is fighting during the conquest and who Goliath is, and how you explain the exorcisms performed by Jesus and what demons are. If you want a copy of this chart, sign up for the email list in the video description. You'll receive more deep Bible tips just like this. And so rebelling angels called the sons of God created the Nephilim giants to attack, influence, and enslave humans. But how would God respond to this to save the human race? Keep watching to find out. There are two versions of the Bible's flood story. One you've heard and one you haven't. Prepare yourself, things are going to get interesting. In one version of the Bible's flood story, God is depicted as the wrathful judge of the human race. But in the lesser known version, he's saving the human race from a terrifying and lethal threat. This version of the story seems to have come first. So, what is it? In a previous video, we determined that the intro to the flood story depicts rebel angels called the sons of God as having children with human women, creating violent giants called the Nephilim. If you missed that video, click here and watch it first. But don't worry, you can easily discover the identity of the sons of God, these angels, by looking at another Old Testament book from about the same time period. It's Job, chapter 38, verses 4-7. In this verse, God says, "Where were you, Job, when I created the earth? The sons of God watched me determine how big the planet would be." I don't know about you, but it seems like humans weren't around when the earth was being made, right? So if the earth wasn't here, then the sons of God can't be human. Two more options come to mind: aliens or angels. Which did the biblical authors mean, though? The writers of the Bible frequently talked about angels, but there don't seem to be any physical extraterrestrials, such as aliens. Just angels that sometimes manifest physically. Now, some of you might believe that you could put those two together and they'd be the same thing. That is an interesting thing to think about. But let's go with angels for now. What happens when we plug that idea into the flood story? What will it help us see that we didn't see before? We might see a new reason for why God had to send the flood in the first place. Or maybe it's the original reason, but it's just long been forgotten. Maybe because it is a bit weird. but it's also kind of fascinating at the same time. Genesis 6:11 says, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence." What does that have to do with these angels, the sons of God? Is there a connection? Well, the earliest Jewish belief was that the angels, the sons of God, were frustrated with God for creating humans. They thought it was a bad idea, just like the serpent in the Garden of Eden who tried to get Adam and Eve killed. But God didn't kill Adam and Eve when they ate the forbidden fruit. He just kicked them out of the Garden of Eden. So some rebel angels came up with a bigger plan to get rid of humans. That's what the Jews believed. Why though? What is their motivation? One way to think of it is this. Job already told us that God had made a family of angels before he made humans, the sons of God. But then God decided to expand his family and make humans. That basically makes us the younger siblings of angels. Have you ever seen a sibling rivalry? A family has a second baby and the older child gets jealous. Well, that's exactly what the Jews believed happened between humans and some of the angels. Not all, but some. It's just basic family dynamics at work. Genesis 6:4 says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. The Jews believed the Nephilim were half angel, half human children of the corrupt sons of God. Sure, the sons of God could get rid of human siblings by tempting them to do bad things, influencing them towards destruction. But that would take many generations to get humans to eliminate themselves. So they had another plan. The sons of God could get rid of humans faster if they could just find a way to cross over from the spiritual world into our physical world. So, in the ancient Jewish belief, the angels came up with this plan to impregnate human women, producing excessively violent giants called the Nephilim. Over in Enoch and some other Dead Sea Scrolls, these giants were described as bloodthirsty. They were thought to present an immediate threat to the human race, killing many. Other scholars think they wanted to rule over humans as evil kings and push them towards extinction, or maybe it's both. You will notice some giant kings later in the Old Testament who actually come out of the Nephilim family tree, such as King Og in Deuteronomy chapter 3, who had a 13.5-foot iron bed. You'll also recognize another giant, Goliath. The Bible drops a few scattered verses to show that the giant Goliath actually descended from the Nephilim. We can see from Genesis 6:5-12 that these giants were able to push the human race towards extreme violence and corruption. Now, humans played a role in this too, by giving in to the corruption. So it's a lot like Adam and Eve's situation in the Garden of Eden, where yes, the serpent tempted them into making a bad decision, but Adam and Eve participated in rebelling, so angels and humans are both at fault. So what is God to do? Well, it's harder for us to judge God's decision than it looks. Genesis 6:5 says humans only thought about evil all the time. Pair that with the excessive violence. Have you ever seen a society that corrupt? Even the most corrupt nation you can think of still isn't that bad. There are innocent people around. The challenge for us is we simply don't have a reference point for this level of corruption. We've never seen it before. So it's hard for us to judge God's decision to send a flood. So to help with that, let's see if we can see things from God's perspective. God sees his family on the verge of dying out. They've actually been listening to the very spirits that have been trying to kill them. Why? Maybe they just wanted power. Maybe they gave in to temptation. But whatever it is, if God doesn't act, the human race will be lost forever. They will either be killed by the Nephilim or they'll kill each other. So a hard reset is really the only way left to save humans. So God's solution to this problem is to send a flood to take out the corrupt portion of humanity along with the giant Nephilim. Even though ancient Jews seemed to be pretty comfortable with the Nephilim story, the early Christian church became skeptical, along with 2nd and 3rd century Jews. We have Augustine of Hippo, who campaigned against the interpretation that the sons of God were angels, and against the Book of Enoch, along with Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. So this version of the story was forgotten for centuries. What happens to the story without the giants, and if we take a human view of the sons of God? Well, in my opinion, God seems less like the savior of the human race and a little more like an angry, wrathful judge. But you could still argue that humans didn't need the giants to corrupt themselves, and God's hand was still forced if he wanted to save his human family from the violence. So you don't have to take the weird giant view to get to the same place. What you'd have to do is put yourself in the position of a father. From God's point of view, his children have become murderers, but there are still 8 innocent people who need someone to save them, and there's no justice system around. There's no government to save them. It's all fallen apart. It is now the wild, wild west. Even worse. So what is God's motivation here? Is it anger? Is it wrath? Well, honestly, if the people were as violent as the story suggests, then anger might be justified and judgment might even be necessary. But I think there's another motivation here, one that goes back to God's reasoning for making humans in the first place, to have a family. The thing to wrestle with is this. Whether you go with the strange Nephilim story or believe this story is strictly speaking about human corruption, either way, God might actually be acting out of compassion. He might not be destroying the human race, he might be saving it. What does the flood story have to do with you and I anyways? Why is this even relevant anymore? Good question. The flood story actually tells us who our enemy is. Let's compare. You could argue that in the modern version of the flood story, our enemy is ourselves. I guess it's debatable, but you could argue that in that version of the story, the spiritual antagonist has been mostly removed. What's left? Humans as the source of evil, or at least the main focus, corrupting ourselves. But the ancient Jewish version of the story that we've been studying had a second layer. It was still taught that humans are fully capable of corrupting ourselves without outside influence. We still have internal battles to fight, but in addition, someone else was tampering with humans, accelerating our corruption, an external spiritual enemy, someone who knew which buttons to push to send us over the edge and into a downward spiral. Sounds like Satan, right? Not quite. The ancient Jewish version of the flood spoke of a whole army of spiritual beings like Satan, in addition to Satan. Modern Christianity often forgets about the corrupt sons of God and simply focuses on one spiritual antagonist, Satan himself, if at all. But the original Jewish understanding of the flood story described the extreme measures our spiritual enemy would be willing to go to get rid of us. Not only crossing worlds, but crossing the species barrier. Humans were both victims and still responsible for the decisions if they participated in the corruption. But this weird stuff is just Old Testament mythology, right? Paul didn't seem to think so. This concept actually comes back in the New Testament. Just take a look at Ephesians 6:12. It says this, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." Notice he says the rulers and authorities. He's not talking about government or political leaders. He's talking about a spiritual enemy. It's the corrupt sons of God, corrupt angels like Satan, including Satan. But what happens if we forget this and we mistake our real enemy for people? Bad things. Division. The world gets messier. If Paul is correct, the angels may not be creating more Nephilim today, but they might be messing with your head and trying to prevent you from becoming the person you were designed to be and becoming a member of God's family. They're not going to go away in the Bible either, not until the very end of the story, where we have a showdown between the corrupt sons of God and Jesus in the last book of the Bible, Revelation. We'll get to that someday. My intent here is not to tell you what to believe, but to inform you of all the different positions so you can wrestle with it and try to figure out what the Bible's really saying. There's another view that this whole thing is a metaphor, that the Nephilim were not really the half-human, half-angel children of the corrupt sons of God, but that they were like the mythological Nephilim of the other cultures in the area. You'll run across that in some modern commentaries. The only problem with that view is there's no literary evidence for it. So it's interesting, but until we get some sign that the author meant for readers to understand the story as a metaphor, well, that theory could be interesting, but it only holds so much weight. If this whole thing is a metaphor, then why do the writers of the Bible give us a family tree for the Nephilim? A genealogy that goes all the way through Goliath and beyond. Personally, that seems kind of strange to me, but you can wrestle with it. And if you want me to explore that view more in a future video, let me know in the comments. Read it, wrestle with it, make your own decision, and remember that there's two worlds here. The New Testament writers will eventually tell us what happened to the sons of God who started this whole mess and their fate. But the Nephilim saga is not over. Notice Genesis 6 verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. How did they come back after the flood? We'll find out when we get to Exodus and the Conquest of Canaan. You're not gonna believe what is hiding there. Hundreds of years after the Bible's flood story, the mysterious Nephilim giants have returned. But how? Didn't the flood wipe them out? Let's find out. So one day I was facilitating a discussion about angels and demons in the Bible, and I said something that nearly made one person fall out of his chair. The Nephilim return after the flood. He looked at me in total disbelief, and he threw a challenge out at me. He said, "Show me one verse in the Bible that says the Nephilim returned after the flood." There's a lot of strange stuff about the Nephilim in other ancient writings, like the Book of Enoch and in the Apocrypha, but is there anything in the Bible itself? Everybody in the room was looking at me to see if I'd be able to come up with a verse that showed the Nephilim alive after the flood. And it does exist. In fact, I'll do you one better. I'll give you two verses. Genesis 6:4, the intro to the flood story, says the Nephilim were on the earth before and after the flood. But wait, there is more. At least 500 years later, they're going to turn up again. After the flood, the Israelites would be enslaved by the Egyptians for 400 years. When they finally escaped, they returned to the land they used to live in, a place called Canaan, the Promised Land. But somebody else was there now. Somebody terrifying. Numbers 13:33 says this, "And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." Oh man, so it really does say the giants, the mysterious Nephilim, returned in the Bible. But how? This introduces a potential problem because it's traditionally taught, if this is taught at all, that the Nephilim died when God sent the flood. So is there a Bible contradiction here? Did God send the flood for nothing? Let's see if we can figure this out. There are at least 3 ways to solve this problem that Bible scholars talk about, and one of them might rock your understanding of the flood story. But that might not be a bad thing. I wonder if you'll resonate with any of these theories, and we'll save the most interesting theory for last. And trust me, it's going to be eye-opening. The first one is unusual, to say the least. It comes from a book that didn't make the Bible. It's from the Genesis Apocryphon, and it claims, well, let me just tell you what it says. Noah's father says, "Then I considered whether the pregnancy was due to the Watchers and Holy Ones or to the Nephilim, and I grew perturbed about this child." What does that mean? This would make the ultimate daytime drama. You might want to sit down for this one. Noah's father was accusing his wife of having an affair with an angel. He thought Noah might be part angel, in other words, half Nephilim. This is a very interesting theory, although it was written a long time after the flood took place, in the 3rd century BC. Most scholars consider this interesting, but almost like a fan fiction take on the original flood story. But what we learn here is this. Even ancient people knew that the Nephilim returned after the flood, and they, just like us, tried to figure out how that might have happened. The second theory discovered a possible loophole in the language of the flood story. Genesis chapter 7 verse 19 says the waters covered all the high points of the land. Well, it seems pretty cut and dry, but scholar Michael Heiser wrote that elsewhere in the Bible, the word all doesn't really mean all. And the word world might not really mean the entire planet. I'll show you what he means. There's an example of this in Genesis chapter 41 verse 57. There we read, "All the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain." He notes that every single human being on the entire planet didn't go to Egypt to buy grain, but that's what the verse appears to say if we take it literally. The Bible may just want you to know that a lot of people were affected, but it's possible it didn't literally mean every single person on the entire planet. So the context of all the earth could refer to all the people that the Bible had mentioned so far, and in this context, the word world would basically mean the world of the people the Bible's been talking about. The world of mankind, where mankind is the tribes listed in the Old Testament. There may have been people elsewhere. It's not real clear, but some Bible scholars do in fact think the door is cracked open just a little bit for an interpretation that the flood didn't cover the entire planet, just the world of the people mentioned in the story of the Bible. Others push back against this theory, asking, well, did God fail then? Because the flood was supposed to take out all of the Nephilim, and if this is true, then it didn't destroy them all. That is a good point, but here's a question to ask. Was the goal of the flood to destroy every single Nephilim, or just destroy their rebellion, like take out most of them so the remaining ones were no longer a threat? If God's goal was just to protect the human race from the threat of the Nephilim and from the corruption that they caused, well, then the flood did succeed. The flood still accomplished its purpose because it dealt the rebellion of the Nephilim a lethal blow. A sub-theory mentioned by my buddy Heath is that, as far as Noah and his family knew, the whole earth did flood. If you put yourself in Noah's perspective, standing in his shoes on the ark, there was probably water as far as he could see. So from his perspective, everything, everywhere, was covered in water. But maybe somewhere else far away, it wasn't. The people on the ark wouldn't know any different. And now, the final theory, and it comes from a Bible passage you're not going to expect, one that many people struggle to explain. It's about head coverings. Have you ever wondered why women had to cover their heads during the biblical period? Paul hints at it in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 10. He says, "That is why a wife ought to wear a symbol of authority on her head." Now, catch this, because of the angels. What? Because of the angels? What is going on here? This hints at another theory on how the Nephilim returned, and I wonder if you caught it. If not, we find another clue as to what Paul might have meant in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's called the Damascus document. Chapter 2, verses 16 through 19 say, For many have gone astray by such thoughts. Even strong and mighty men of old faltered through them, and still do. When they went about in their willful heart, the watchers of heaven fell, that's the angels, and were ensnared by it. For they did not observe the commandments of God. Their sons, so the children of the angels, who were as tall as cedars, and whose bodies were as big as mountains, fell by it. Who does that sound like? It's the Nephilim. This is another verse about angels, called the Watchers here, lusting over women and having children with them. Yeah, it's kind of weird, but what's the connection to head coverings? We need some more clues. There's actually one in 1 Corinthians 11:15. There, Paul says, "If a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for long hair is given to her as a covering." I wonder if you can see the problem with the way this verse has been translated. Paul had just said a few verses prior that women have to cover their hair, right? But here it says their hair is her covering. So how can hair be both her covering and need a covering? The English translation actually doesn't make sense. But the problem isn't Paul, and the problem's not the Bible itself. What I'm about to say is going to sound crazy, so I want to first mention that this theory has been published in an academic journal, the Society of Biblical Literature, and it has been peer-reviewed by other scholars. According to scholar Troy Martin from Xavier University, the word used here for covering can also be translated as prepare yourself. I don't know how else to tell you this. It's testicle. Yeah, it's weird, but Paul didn't mean that literally. What Paul really meant was that long hair was thought of in the ancient world as a part of the reproduction system, an extension of the reproduction system. And in fact, that's exactly what ancient people thought during this time period. If you want to know more details, you should look up Troy Martin's work on JSTOR.org or listen to the Naked Bible podcast number 86, where I first discovered this theory. But you might actually have heard this before and you just didn't realize it. Let me explain. For instance, have you ever heard that long hair is a symbol of fertility? Think about that for a minute. Why would long hair be a symbol of fertility? You may have heard that from other mythology. It's a much milder way of saying long hair was believed to be an extension of the reproductive organs. We know for a fact that ancient people thought this way about long hair from the writings of, check out these famous names, Hippocrates, Tertullian, Aristotle. A woman dangling her hair while she bowed her head to pray was thought to cause the angels to lust over her. When Paul was talking about head coverings, according to this theory, he was thinking of Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Yeah, that's the chapter where the Nephilim were first created, when the angels took human wives, mating with them, creating the giants. This hints at something called the repopulation theory. It's the belief that the angels, rebel angels, mated with human women again after the flood to create more Nephilim, which is exactly what the Damascus document that we looked at was saying. It was suggesting that the angels impregnated more human women after the flood, but the Bible itself doesn't say for certain. But Paul wasn't willing to take any chances, hence why he said women should cover their heads. So, our final theories. 1. Someone on the ark was a Nephilim. That's probably the most unlikely theory. 2. The flood was local. This could be supported by finagling some of the verbiage in the Bible a little bit, but the door is cracked open for that possibility at least. And 3rd, the angels made more Nephilim after the flood. So which of these theories seems most plausible to you? Let me know in the comments. I actually don't know which theory is correct, and I think that's okay. This isn't something that's an essential part of the Bible. It is an important part of the story, but it's not an essential. It's actually okay to not take a position on this. But I do find the story fascinating, and I hope you do too. We don't have a clear answer about how the Nephilim came back. The only thing the Bible says for sure is that somehow they did come back. And people have been wrestling with this mystery since the biblical period. If you want to research this topic on your own, I highly recommend the books Supernatural or the more detailed version, Unseen Realm. Both are by Dr. Michael Heiser. Check the links in the video description for how to get those books. You're probably asking though, if the Nephilim came back, what happened to them? What did they do? Believe it or not, the Nephilim storyline leads to a direct confrontation with Jesus himself. What? Yeah, I think it's something that most people miss, but subscribe if you want to know more, because we're gonna get there. Did ancient giants walk among us, or were they simply human enemies exaggerated to make them appear more menacing, making us appear like grasshoppers by comparison? I have never received so many questions and comments from YouTubers about a single verse of the Bible. So you guys asked for it, here it is. We're gonna put the Old Testament description of the Nephilim giants to the test. This investigation will give you a skill that you can use for the rest of your life whenever you're studying the Bible. The verse in question comes from the Old Testament book of Numbers, and it's a monumental challenge to interpret. So I won't judge you no matter what you believe. We'll just investigate the evidence together, and I'll reveal where I sit at the end. After Moses and the Israelites were freed from slavery in Egypt, we come across the first appearance of the Nephilim after the flood. Now that's a whole can of worms for another day, but Moses sent spies into Canaan to see if they could take the land back.
The name's Bond, James Bond.
Not that kind of spy. But our mystery verse comes from Numbers 13, and it's verse 33. It says, "And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." Your burning question has been, exactly how tall were these monstrous giants in Canaan? If this verse is literal, we're talking about some really tall giants, like 50 to 100 times taller than humans. On the other hand, this could be hyperbolic language, or even an exaggeration to make the giants seem even more terrifying. Get a load of this guy. Gnarly. He looks like a Batman villain. Okay, so I grew up on comic books. Sometimes I get a little carried away with the artwork, but I did this to make a point. This picture conveys fear a lot better than, say, this picture, doesn't it? The same can be done with words. But on the other hand, maybe they looked more like this. That's maybe a little more realistic. This actually brings up a big challenge that can sabotage us and prevent us from understanding passages of the Bible. When we're reading, how in the world are we supposed to know if something was meant literally or metaphorically? Here's what happens. Some people are afraid to take anything from the Bible metaphorically, just in case they accidentally deny something that was actually meant literally. And I get that. That has good intentions behind it. They're afraid that you might take that too far and start assuming that, well, maybe Jesus never returned from the dead. What if there's a way to tell the difference though? What if there's a test? Let me demonstrate something. In real life, let's say you're playing a basketball or football game and you beat the other team by 20 or 30 points. It's not even close. Then you go home and you tell your significant other and your friends, "Man, we killed them." Did you now? Did you literally kill them? Do I have to call the cops? I don't know. You see what I mean though? We actually still use metaphoric language every day. It's a part of how we speak. Well, there was some of that in the Bible too, and we actually know this deep down. We just don't think about it that much. So for instance, we know there's room in the Bible for metaphor because in the New Testament, Jesus said things like, "I am the door," or "I am the bread of life." Well, we know Jesus wasn't literally saying he's a door or a loaf of bread, but these verses still mean something very important. He was trying to tell us something about who he is using symbolism. The same could be the case here. We don't know. We need a way to test verses to see if they're literal or metaphoric. At the same time, we can't just rush in assuming everything that's weird or unusual is not real. People think I'm weird. I mean, am I not real? Actually, I did receive some YouTube comments recently about that. Are you computer animated? Dude, I'm like right here.
You're not real, man.
We might actually miss something if we were to automatically assume that these weird, strange ideas in the Bible, like the Nephilim giants, or the existence of Satan, evil spirits, and afterlife, are not real. After all, we are dealing with a supernatural book here that tells us that there's another world besides just our physical world. There is a spiritual realm too. So we need clues or hints. We need a test of some kind. Real data that would help us know that a particular passage isn't meant to be taken at face value. Maybe the writer used a common literary technique that scholars recognize as metaphoric. A modern definition of metaphor is a figure of speech that makes a non-literal comparison between two unlike things. Ancient people did this too. So what if the description of humans appearing like grasshoppers compared to the giants wasn't meant to give us a true sense of scale or height? Look, to be frank, you and I are not experts at identifying ancient figures of speech. We're gonna need some help from scholars. So I whipped out a book, Figures of Speech Used in the Bible, Explained and Illustrated. And it says, a figure of speech is a word or sentence thrown into a peculiar form. I know what you're thinking. I'm so bored. My brain is shutting down. Look, I always hated English class too, but this could be helpful. Look at the sentence structure. We were like grasshoppers. We have a comparison here, and it's weird. It fits the criteria of a possible metaphor. We can't assume yet. We need help from people who study this stuff professionally with their lives. So let's break out the commentaries. I picked out a few sources to see what their stance was, literal or metaphor. First is Zondervan's Cultural Background Study Bible. It says the writer of Numbers was trying to say they felt like grasshoppers compared to the Anakim, who, remember, descend from the Nephilim. Chalk 1 point up for metaphor. This commentary gives us some other interesting meat too. They think the writer chose to depict the Israelites as grasshoppers because grasshoppers were the smallest insect people were allowed to eat. Doesn't that sound delicious? By choosing the grasshopper, they're depicting fear, saying the Nephilim could basically eat us alive. That's actually an interesting potential link to the Book of Enoch, which describes the Nephilim giants as cannibals. On the other hand, this particular study Bible does tend to take too much metaphorically. I think they make the mistake of categorizing things metaphorically just because they're strange or supernatural, not because there's some reason in the text to take something symbolically. So as a rule of thumb, I always check more than one scholar's work so I can then decide for myself. I would recommend that you do the same. So let's check out commentary number 2. Faith Life Study Bible, the best study Bible I can find, by the way. Check the links in the video description if you want to get a copy. It says, the comparison to grasshopper is a metaphor indicating the height of the Anakim should be of great concern. Chalk 2 points up for metaphor. They think the point the writer was trying to make wasn't to tell us about their height, but to show how frightening and powerful they were. I mean, their height too, but not literally. So let's try a newer commentary. The New International Commentary on Numbers. This book finally gives us some deeper clues that are going to be more helpful. According to them, there is in fact a recognizable figure of speech being used by the writer here, if you know what to look for. So they say their self-description as grasshoppers is a figure of speech called meiosis, which diminishes one thing to increase the size or importance of something else. Meiosis, Sounds like some kind of disease.
That's disgusting!
But now we actually have identified a legit metaphoric technique that ancient writers used. So let's go back to figures of speech used in the Bible explained and illustrated. The source that melts my brain.
My brain hurts!
There's also a recognizable literary technique referred to as belittling. So this book is going to say meiosis and belittling are the same thing. One thing is diminished in order to increase another thing. By this definition, the writer of Numbers may have been exaggerating how small the Israelites were compared to the giants. Okay, it's time to use our newfound interpretation skills. Back to the Numbers verse. We seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them being the Nephilim. Well, now that we know what to look for, we can now recognize meiosis or belittling in this verse. There's hyperbole here, belittling the Israelites to show how much more powerful the giants were, how much more frightening and terrifying they were. Like this. Okay, not quite like that. All right, well, how do you know you don't take this too far? By comparison, the passages about Jesus' resurrection don't contain this metaphoric language. They don't usually say things like, it was like he died, or it was like he returned from the dead. In fact, those passages contain some other clues that will key us into whether or not Jesus' resurrection was literal or metaphoric. It's people's reactions, surprised reactions from eyewitnesses. You see their struggle to believe it because it wasn't normal, but they wrestled with it. They even argued about it until finally they accepted that, hey, maybe we're not crazy. They did actually see Jesus alive after he died. Finally, in Acts 5:32, they're ready to tell people we were witnesses to those events. The inclusion of a human perspective and reaction tell us that those passages are probably not meiosis or hyperbole. Now you have a skill. You can test passages yourself to see if they're literal or metaphoric. So where do I sit? I am leaning heavily towards the idea that the height of the giants in Numbers was metaphoric. It seems to fit a common recognizable format that language experts can spot. However, there's still nothing here to suggest that they're not still giants. We just don't know how giant. And if you're familiar with the Nephilim storyline, a metaphoric height doesn't disqualify them of having a supernatural origin. Something frightening lurks in Canaan, and it's really, really tall. There's one story in the Old Testament that people find difficult to reconcile, where God seems to have told his followers to annihilate entire people groups in Canaan. It's where the claim that God commanded genocide comes from. But a few rarely discussed verses change the entire meaning of that story. Sometimes they're deemed too weird to talk about, or maybe they're just difficult to piece together. But I think we can do it. Who or what was living in Canaan when God told the Israelites to annihilate these towns? Let's do a deep dive. I guarantee it's going to change the way you see the Old Testament. The setup for the conquest goes something like this. Imagine you bought a house, and you lived there for a few years, and then a global emergency caused a food shortage. And your town suddenly has no food. So you have to temporarily move to another state or country so your family can survive. You rent a second house, but the crisis keeps going on and on. The people in your new town turn on you, and the other people who moved there. They enslave you for generations. You even die there. But then, your distant great-great-great-great-grandkids escape, and they return to your homeland. But you've been gone so long that somebody else moved in. Someone terrifying. Someone not quite human. Wait, what? Hang on, it's coming. This is basically the story of the first 5 books of the Bible. After the flood and the Tower of Babel incident, the people who followed God were enslaved by the Egyptians for 400 years. When they finally returned to their homeland of Canaan, someone else had taken over, or something. Here's where things get sticky. When the Hebrew people were freed from slavery, God said, hey, I'm going to give you your homeland back, but there are a few towns there that I need you to visit and annihilate everyone there. Yeah. It's an uncomfortable story, which is why the verses that are rarely talked about are so important. Most people would just stop right here and ask, did God commit genocide? The traditional answer says the Canaanites were morally corrupt and must be destroyed. They're looked at as a virus or a disease that could infect the rest of the world with moral corruption if they're not stopped. What if I told you that's not exactly the Bible's explanation for this? The key question that we need to ask is, who were these people? The earliest verse about blotting out these towns is in Exodus chapter 23, verses 23 through 24. And they say this, when my angel goes before you and brings you to the Amorites, and the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Canaanites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I blot them out, you shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do as they do, for you shall utterly overthrow them and break their pillars into pieces. I wish I could dive into the mysterious angel here, but I'm going to cover that in another video. Just notice for now, there is much more to this story than meets the eye. Now to the conquest victims. The people that God wanted the Israelites to destroy were Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Has anyone bothered to look these people up? Who are they? We can look them up. Most people wouldn't take the time to do this detective work, but it's really important and it's going to be worth it. First, all these people living in Canaan, these are just different names for Canaanites. But let's start with the Amorites. I wonder here if there are any other verses in the Bible that tell us who the Amorites were. A Google search turns up Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 11, which mentions an Amorite king that the Israelites battled. His name was King Og, and he had a 13.5-foot-long iron bed. That's a little odd. Who slept on a bed that long in those days? Maybe we should see if any other Old Testament verses mention the Amorites for more clues. The next verse that comes up is Amos chapter 2, verse 9, and it says this, "Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of cedars, and who was strong as the oaks. I destroyed his fruit above and his roots below." A king as tall as cedars. That description sounds very similar to Goliath, the giant that David fought. And wait, no, it can't be them, can it? There's something else here. Deuteronomy 3:11 says Og was the last of the Rephaim. A quick search in Logos Bible software uncovers that the Rephaim were also unusually tall people. The King James translation actually chose a different word instead of Rephaim. They translated this word as giants. We better check the Hebrew on this one. Lexham Bible Dictionary reveals a huge can of worms hidden here. There are 3 ways that the Bible translates the word Rephaim. Giants, shades, which means spirits of the dead, or the dead, like in the book of Job, chapter 26, verse 5. Lexham says it is difficult to identify whether the Rephaim were humans, living or dead, quasi-divine figures, or disembodied spirits. The Old Testament usage associates the term with all of these possibilities. In fact, the modern-day Hebrew word for ghost is an evolution of the word Rephaim. So based on this, the Israelites were fighting either a human king, a ghost, a giant, or a quasi-divine figure. Note that the Nephilim were both giants and quasi-divine figures. Well, since King Og had a giant bed, I'm doubting he's a ghost, because what kind of ghost needs a physical bed? Only a very tall person needs a bed that's 13.5 feet long. Are there any other verses in the Bible that talk about very tall people? two come to mind. The most obvious story is Goliath the giant. 1 Samuel 17:4 says, Goliath was from Gath, and his height was 6 cubits and a span. I had to Google that to figure out how tall that was, but it's 9.75 feet. That sounds about like a giant. There's one other really important verse about unusually tall people in the conquest story. Numbers 13:33. When the Hebrew people returned to their old homeland, they sent spies into the land of Canaan to see who had taken over the land, and what they saw scared them so badly that they wanted to give up returning home. What did they see? Numbers 13:33 gives us the answer. It says, we saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Ooh, man, the Nephilim are back. If you don't know who they are, watch this video. In short though, the Bible describes them as the children of fallen angels and human women. They were giants like the Titans. Ancient Jews thought they were created intentionally by jealous angels to kill off the human race or rule over them. Most of them died in the flood, but according to Numbers 13:33, here they are again in Canaan, standing between the Hebrew people and their homeland. Now some are going to chalk this up to a mistranslation and say, oh, there's no proof that the Nephilim were actually giants. That's too weird. They've got to just be people. And no scripture directly links the Nephilim to giants. They may even say this interpretation is forcing Greek mythology into the Bible. Okay, I understand where they're coming from. Honestly, I thought this too the first time I heard this. But there's something you should see. Let's see if there's any proof in the Bible itself that the Nephilim were really giants. There are 2 pieces of evidence we need to look at. Exhibit A. Most people accept that Goliath was a giant, so let's trace his lineage backwards and see what we find. We know the Bible says he was approximately 10 feet tall. Although Goliath was a Philistine, 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 4 says he was actually from Gath. So now let's look up verses about Gath and see what we find there. Joshua 11:22 comes up as a possibility, and it says, there were still some Anakim living in Gath. Where have we seen that before? Numbers 13:33 said the Anakim were the descendants of the Nephilim. It took 3 scattered Bible verses, but once you line them up, you can draw a straight line through them that shows the giant Goliath was probably connected to the Nephilim. But the next one is truly the nail in the coffin. Exhibit B. This one is so exciting to me. I vaguely remembered from my theology class with Michael Heiser that the Hebrew word for Nephilim in Numbers 13 contained a hidden clue. Take a look at the Hebrew word for Nephilim in Genesis 6 compared to how it appears in Numbers 13:33. Do you notice something slightly different? A writer made a subtle modification to the word Nephilim in Numbers. I wonder what it is. It takes a Hebrew expert to catch this. If I hadn't learned this from Michael Heiser, I don't know if I would have found it. Here is the word for giant or titan in Hebrew. Look familiar? The word Nephilim is actually formed off of the word giant. Scholars think this verse in Numbers about the Nephilim was actually added to make sure that people knew the giants in the conquest were connected to the Nephilim from Genesis 6, 1-4. Ancient readers would know the Nephilim were giants. This type of technique was common among ancient writers, and this is how they linked ideas for the reader to understand. Unfortunately, this clue is invisible in the English Bible. Today's English equivalent of this kind of technique might look something like this. What if I wrote the word Nephilim and I added a hyphen followed by the word giants? Oof. Once you have this information, it becomes hard to avoid the giant interpretation. There's really no way to escape from the Nephilim in the Old Testament. And I'm fine with that because personally, this is kind of fascinating. The Nephilim family tree contains a number of different people groups, which make it really hard to trace the Nephilim story. You actually have to work hard to put the pieces together. This verse from Numbers shows that the Anakim were descendants of the Nephilim. So wherever we see the name Anakim or sons of Anak, we now know that they're talking about the children of half-angel giants, someone carrying fallen angel DNA. Wow. While the Amorites were never directly called Nephilim, their king was certainly described as a giant. We still need to figure out, though, who the other groups God commanded to be annihilated were. The Hittites, the Hivites, Jebusites, Perizzites. They all lived in Canaan, but what else do they have in common? Another clue comes from Numbers 13, 28 and 29, and it says, the sons of Anak, or the Anakim, which we now know were descendants of the Nephilim, lived among the Hittites, Jebusites, and Canaanites. Are you starting to see how the dots connect? The children of the Nephilim live in those towns, giants. The last two people groups are the Hivites, whom scholars think are connected to the Hittites, so we may be able to lump them together, and we're left with the Perizzites. They are mentioned again in Deuteronomy 7:1, alongside all the other cities that were harboring the giants, and again in Joshua 11:3, same thing, living among the Amorites, Hittites, and Jebusites. If we connect the dots, we discover one common factor between these people groups. The Nephilim lived among these people groups. While there are only 3 verses that contain the word Nephilim, if you factor in the whole Nephilim family tree, the word Anakim, Rephaim, you'll find at least 50 total verses. Given the supernatural origin of the Nephilim and their very large height, it seems the target of the conquest wasn't human at all. It was the Nephilim giants' descendants called the Anakim. The giants that many believe are only in books that didn't make the Bible, like Enoch and the Apocrypha. We did some hard work and we found they're right here in the Bible. I think there's an explanation for why God commanded the conquest of the Anakim too. Remember when God promised he would never again send a large-scale flood to destroy all life on earth? The Nephilim were part of the reason he sent the flood in the first place. That's why it was necessary. Here, the same threat has emerged again, trying to stop God from having a human family. This time, though, God acted sooner and partnered with humans to stop the Nephilim. The conquest was God's alternative to sending another flood. It was almost a prevention. If the conquest never happened, it's possible the world would have become like it was right before the flood. Humanity may have gone extinct. And also, if Israel is never born, well, you and I may never have heard of God today. It's worth noting that no genocide actually took place here. All of the people groups listed as conquest targets are still alive later. You see them in 2 Chronicles 8:7, and King Solomon even took Hittites as wives. It seems the conquest may have only targeted villages in the hill country where the giants were spotted and had been living. Some people really struggle with this weird giant interpretation because it so closely resembles other mythology. But look at it this way. It's only weird if the spiritual realm doesn't exist. The only prerequisites for this conclusion to have a logical path are God, a spiritual reality, and angels. And those are all cornerstone claims of the Bible. So I say, embrace the weird when it makes sense. Whatever interpretation you settle on, just consider this. The writer was trying to tell you something. He didn't write this to entertain us. To me, it seems he was trying to tell us about the drastic lengths that evil, Satan, fallen angels were willing to go to keep us from joining God's family. Wait a sec though. Didn't Exodus 23 say an angel was leading the conquest? Who was that? The answer to that is going to turn your world upside down. Who really killed the Nephilim? One day I saw something in the Bible that I had never seen before, and it made my jaw hit the floor. A mysterious character that many people don't notice. a character who might be the most important character in the entire Old Testament. Yet, I've never heard anyone talk about it or teach on it. Until now. I had been studying a story in the Bible that I and a lot of people struggle with. The Conquest of Canaan, where God seems to have told the Israelites to annihilate entire villages. Growing up, I thought, maybe this part of the Old Testament was a misunderstanding. Like people misunderstood what God really wanted, and maybe they used religion to justify going to war. Maybe they said, God told us to go conquer this land, but it was really just their own thoughts that led them to do that. Then I discovered I'd actually been missing part of the story. It was right there in the Bible, but I was reading right over it. One day I heard somebody talking about Exodus 23 in a lecture, and I realized Moses and Joshua didn't really lead the conquest. Not exactly. They usually get credit for it, but somebody else was there, or something. In a recent video, we discovered a lost part of the conquest storyline. The Nephilim giants who appeared before the flood had somehow appeared again after the flood. They were living in the land Israel once called home before the Israelites were enslaved by the Egyptians. When the Israelites finally escaped from Egypt, they would have to face the giants in order to return home. We learned that the goal of the conquest wasn't to wipe out other humans, but it seems to have been to wipe out the Nephilim giants and their descendants, like King Og and Goliath and the Anakim. But there's another important part of the story that's been overlooked. Who really led the Israelites to battle against the giants? You are about to discover the Bible's best kept secret, and it could change the way you see the entire Old Testament. It could even be life-changing. People have puzzled over this passage for centuries. Exodus 23 says God sent an angel. He calls him his messenger to lead the people to conquer Canaan. The angel then led them to battle, to cities and places in the hill country where the Nephilim giants had been spotted or were known to be living among other people. In the past, when I've heard this story taught, I was always hearing that Joshua had led the conquest, but I don't remember there being an angel in the story. So I wonder who this character is. A huge secret lies here. To discover his identity, we have to go back in time to his first appearances. But there's a trick to finding these verses. You're not going to find them if you just search for the term angel or even the term angel of the Lord. That's because he's not called an angel in his earliest appearances. There's a good reason for this. Most of us today are operating under a huge misconception about what angels actually are. They're not a type of being. What is an angel? To figure this out, we're going to have to consult an expert scholar on angels, and I just happened to study under one, Dr. Michael Heiser. In his book, Angels, we will find something interesting. Page 17 says, an angel is not a type of being or species. It's actually a job description. It means messenger, and the English term angel is used to tell you that the messenger is not human. It's a spirit being. So now you know. Angel is like the mailman of the spiritual realm. But in other places, they're called other things like spirits, stars, holy ones, even gods with a lowercase g. So to solve this, we may have to look at all appearances by spiritual beings, not just verses that mention angels. We're going to have to gather 6 clues from 6 chapters to figure out who this angel is. And the answer is going to be pretty mind-blowing. Number 1, Genesis 12. This is the chapter where God started forming a nation called Israel, who was supposed to basically function as a lighthouse and bring the other nations scattered at Babel back into God's family. So God kicks off this plan by choosing one man named Abram. But he did that in a very surprising, hands-on fashion. Abraham didn't just think he heard God's voice in his head. Genesis 12:7 says, the Lord appeared to him in Canaan. Well, that's interesting because Canaan is the location of the conquest. And God said, I will give your descendants this land. If you spend some time thinking about it, this passage kind of reads like God physically showed up himself in person to deliver this message to Abram. So is this a metaphor or a dream? Is this literal? And if God appeared to people, well, what did he look like? What form did he take? Tuck that away for now. We need some more information first, so let's keep reading. Passage number 2. Genesis 15 contains another clue, and it says, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. The last verse we looked at read more like a possible literal appearance, but this chapter specifies we're talking about a vision. Here, God made a covenant with Abram that he would protect him and give him a son and make his descendants as numerous as the stars. So this message is similar to the last appearance. The Hebrew word used here for vision seems to imply something beyond a normal dream, though. I looked up the Hebrew word used for vision in the Dictionary of Biblical Languages, and it says a rational communication from God to an individual, with a possible focus on the visual aspects of that communication. This word is used elsewhere in the Bible, so looking up some of those verses might help us understand what it means. One of these other occurrences was about a seer or an oracle named Balaam in the Book of Numbers. The word there seems to mean something more like a supernatural vision than a dream. In this vision, Genesis 15:20 says God told him he'd give his descendants the same land that the angel later led the Israelites to reclaim from the giants. So there's another link there. Only Genesis 15 contains an extra interesting detail. God said he'd give Abram's descendants the land of the Rephaim. A word that we previously discovered refers to an ancient race of giants. This verse straight up tells us that later on when the Israelites go into Canaan, they're going to be fighting against giants. Passage number 3. God appeared yet again to Abram, who at this point in the story has changed his name to Abraham. So God appeared to him near the oak trees. They had another in-person conversation, but this time we need to do some detective work to figure out what's really going on here. Keep track of how many men Abraham was visiting with. He looked up and he saw 3 men standing in front of him. One of them, it says, is the Lord. So 3 men. Or were they really men? They shared a meal together. And then when they left, God said something pretty chilling. He said, hey, we're on our way to destroy the city of Sodom. But Abraham started bartering with God, trying to save the city. So God stays behind to negotiate while the other 2 men go ahead towards the city of Sodom. If you pay attention to the math here, we started out with an appearance of 3 mysterious men. You must realize by now that one of the men was God. Whoa. So now we've learned that God had been appearing to Abraham in the form of a man in the Old Testament. Passage number 4. If we continue reading, Genesis 19 kicks off by saying, the 2 angels came to Sodom. When they went into the city, they gave a message to Lot. So now, instead of calling the 2 men men, the Bible switches to calling them angels. You see what's going on here? The men who previously appeared to Abraham, they were spirits, what we call angels. So now you could reasonably conclude that when God appeared to Abraham in the form of a man, well, technically, he's a visitor from another realm, the spiritual realm. So technically, God is appearing as an angel. Now, you're probably wondering, if these men were angels, where are their wings? But the Bible actually never says angels have wings. In fact, according to history today, the artistic depiction of angels with wings didn't emerge until the 4th century AD, several hundred years after the Bible was written. But in the Bible itself, angels don't seem to have wings. Sometimes they're indistinguishable from humans, and there was one angel in particular that the Bible called the angel of the Lord. Passage number 5. The angel of the Lord himself is finally named in Genesis chapter 22, when God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. There's an important clue in the way that the angel talks. First, he calls to Abraham from heaven, so right away we should know that we're dealing with something that's not human. But then he says, "Don't harm Isaac, because now I know you fear God, because you have not withheld your son, your only son," now get this, "from me." Notice the angel switched from speaking about God to speaking as if he is God. So is this angel of the Lord actually God himself, appearing as a man, just like what we previously saw in Genesis? Some scholars will say that in the ancient world, messengers would sometimes speak as if they were the king. And maybe that's what the angel is doing here. The angel's not actually God, he's just speaking as if he were God, speaking on God's behalf with his authority. So now what do? We're faced with two opposing views, and there are very smart scholars on both sides. So how are we going to decide which view is correct? One thing we could consider is, why didn't any of the prophets speak as if they were God? And when Jesus spoke as if he was God in the New Testament, people saw that as blasphemy worthy of death. One thing we can do is see if any of the other passages depict the angel as God. Does the view that the angel isn't God work for all of the angel of the Lord passages? The next passage should help us decide if the angel is God or simply an angel speaking on God's behalf. Passage number 6, the parting of the Red Sea in Exodus. Now that we're actually focusing on the angel of the Lord, he seems to be literally everywhere in the Old Testament. But when this story is taught, he's usually not mentioned. Exodus chapter 14 verse 19 contains a clue, if you know what to look for. It says the angel of God, the angel of the Lord, went out before the Israelites as Pharaoh's army approached. This would have meant something very clearly to an ancient person. According to scholar John Walton, in ancient writings, gods always marched out to battle in front of the armies they represented. So here, the Egyptians would have believed that their god Ammon was marching out before Pharaoh's army. But notice who is in the position of the God of Israel. Who marched out before them? It's not God. It's the angel of the Lord. So this story would be considered a heresy unless the angel is God, just like what we saw in the story about the sacrifice of Isaac. In this story, the angel of the Lord is standing in the shoes God is supposed to be standing in. If the angel is not understood as God, then this story would probably have been rejected by the ancient Jews, because only gods do that. Only gods lead nations to battle. It seems these stories all depict the angel of the Lord as God himself, in human form. So let's take that theory and look at Exodus 23 and see if the angel is depicted as God there. Verse 21 says, "Do not rebel against him, for my name is in him." What does "my name is in him" mean? Something similar happens in a couple other passages. If you read how the word name is used there, well, maybe we can find some clues. Psalm 75:1 says, "God's name is near his people." Isaiah 30:27 says, "The name of the Lord comes from afar." Here's the clearest clue. Proverbs 18:10, "The name of the Lord is a strong tower." Now, we know God's name isn't literally a strong tower, so what does this mean? Let me show you something. What happens if I cross out the word name in these passages? Try to fill in the blank, like Wheel of Fortune. You might notice that plugging the word God in place of name actually makes a lot more sense. This is actually a cultural practice. It turns out that the phrase, the name, is a common way ancient people used to refer to God without actually saying his name. There was a hesitancy to use the name of God for fear of accidentally misusing his name. So the Israelites would sometimes substitute other names for God, such as Adonai, or phrases like the name. According to the Faith Life Study Bible, modern Jews actually still do this today. So if we plug that idea into Exodus 23, we get God saying, "Do not rebel against him, for I am in him." If that's not convincing enough, here are two more clues. There's a reference here showing that the angel has the power to forgive sins. Jews believed only God could forgive sins. So here we have an angel doing something only God can do, something that Jesus also got in trouble for saying later with the Pharisees. And finally, verse 22 holds a key. A certain something in this verse should sound familiar to you. In it, God says, "If you carefully obey the angel's voice and do all that I say," do all that who says? Is God or the angel talking? Where did we see something like that before? This is basically the same thing we saw the angel doing back in Genesis chapter 22 in the sacrifice of Isaac story. It turns out many ancient Jews viewed the angel as God, appearing in the form of a man, sometimes called the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament. Now this is hotly debated. Are modern Bible scholars really on board with this idea? Scholars John Walton and Craig Keener's commentary is not on board with this interpretation, but other credible scholars, John D. Barry, Michael Heiser, Tim Mackey of the Bible Project, the well-known Haley's Bible Commentary, and many more sources are on board. And in fact, the view that God was appearing in a second form as a human in the Old Testament is a forgotten Jewish belief called the two powers in heaven. And it predates the New Testament by a minimum of 200 years. So I guess you'll have to wrestle with this and decide for yourself which interpretation you think is more complete. Is the angel God himself appearing in the form of a man? Or is the angel just a mere angel? Now that we've established that there's a good case the angel of the Lord is God himself, did God come down to earth and lead the conquest against the Nephilim himself? Did God fight the Nephilim personally alongside Israel? It seems likely that maybe this wasn't such a human war after all. This story makes people uncomfortable though, understandably, and they fear that in the future, another leader could come along and say God told them to go on a religious conquest. But understanding the story's full context might actually be the key to preventing these tragedies. If anyone today were to claim that God told them to go on a conquest, we should be highly skeptical. It's really important to notice how the conquest in the Bible was different than any other human battle. We could say to this leader, wait a sec, did God personally appear to you in person and tell you to do this? And then also appear to all of your people? And did he then personally lead you in battle? If the answer is no, then what they're talking about doing is not like the Old Testament conquest. There will probably be nothing like it ever again. Believe it or not, we're actually only halfway through the verses on this investigation. We hit the major Old Testament verses, but we still need to ask, what did the New Testament writers believe about this? Who did they believe led the conquest against the Nephilim in Canaan? Will they take the position that God appeared as a man before Jesus was even born? We'll hit those verses next, and it will reveal an even deeper layer of who really led the conquest of Canaan. Jesus versus the Nephilim.
It's the stupidest combination I ever heard in my life!
You might think that sounds like a crazy sci-fi show, but what if I told you that's actually part of the Old Testament in the Bible?
So you're telling me there's a chance?
Did Jesus really hunt down the Nephilim giants? Let's find out by asking the writers of the New Testament. There's one overlooked verse in the New Testament that is truly shocking. So what's it say? It reveals the identity of a certain angel in the Old Testament, the angel of the Lord. Before we look at this verse though, you'll need to know that the angel personally led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, an event called the Exodus. Then the angel led them in the Conquest of Canaan, a battle to retake their old homeland and destroy the Nephilim giants' descendants. We see the angel of the Lord standing with a drawn sword in the book of Numbers. Later in Joshua chapter 5, he will be called the commander of the Lord's army. So it seems this angel was depicted as a warrior. We're told in Exodus chapter 23 that the angel led the Israelites towards people they would soon battle: the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now that might not mean much to you now, but in a previous video we discovered that according to the Old Testament, the descendants of the Nephilim giants lived at these locations. The angel of the Lord led the Israelites there to battle them. So, do you want to know who the New Testament writers believed this angel was? It's Jesus. That might sound kind of shocking, but in Jude 5, Jude wrote that Jesus led the Exodus. It's kind of a shocker. And if this is true, then, well, whenever you see the angel of the Lord in the Bible parting the Red Sea, leading the battle against the Canaanites and the Nephilim, it means Jesus was there in spirit form. It's a provocative but fascinating claim. And Jude is claiming more than just that. We already learned in the last video that people living in the Old Testament period believed that the angel of the Lord was a manifestation of God himself, appearing in the form of a man in the Old Testament. So when Jude said Jesus led the Exodus, by default, he's also saying Jesus is God. I'll break it down for you. If A equals B and B equals C, well then A equals C too, right? So if the angel equals God, and the angel equals Jesus, well then God also equals Jesus. Jude took an Old Testament passage about God and substituted Jesus in place of God, not to change the story, but because he believes they're the same being. He believed Jesus is a second form of God, who came to earth in the Old Testament to free his people from slavery and lead them to eliminate the threat of the Nephilim and their descendants. Although many of the Bible's ancient manuscripts say Jesus did lead the Exodus in Jude 5, the English Standard Version of the Bible was one of the first English Bibles brave enough to actually translate Jude 5 this way in English. But then you may notice a tiny footnote in your Bible, and it might say something like, some manuscripts don't say Jesus. They read as God led the Exodus, or the Lord led the Exodus. Uh-oh. So how are we going to figure out which one of these translations was in the original writing? Did Jesus really appear in the Old Testament and lead the Exodus and the conquest against the Nephilim? Or did this Bible verse become exaggerated over time? Make your predictions, because we're going to trace the evidence backwards and we're going to find out. First, we can date all existing copies of Jude. So take a look at this chart. Most ancient copies either say Jesus led the Exodus or the Lord led the Exodus. There are more primary sources, which are considered to be more reliable, that support the reading that Jesus led the Exodus in Jude 5. The oldest copies of Jude also say Jesus led the Exodus. So why did this other translation that says the Lord led the Exodus emerge, that removed Jesus' name? Scholar Bartholomew believes this verse was so controversial that some scribes just weren't comfortable with the reading, so they changed it to Lord to make it more palatable, easier for readers to accept. Now, he's not alone in his opinion. Dr. Michael Heiser, who does believe Jesus led the Exodus, also said that one of the jobs of a scribe is to make a story easier to understand and digest, not more difficult. So scholars often use a rule of thumb that the more difficult reading is probably the original. They believe Jesus' name was removed from this verse and replaced with Lord, which might account for why the oldest manuscripts seem to say Jesus. But what if we're wrong? What if Jude 5 didn't originally say Jesus led the Exodus? Okay, well, let's pretend we don't have this verse as evidence. Did any other New Testament authors believe Jesus was the angel who did all of these things? There's a clue in Mark chapter 1, verse 2. Here, Mark quotes an Old Testament verse, but he doesn't cite it, so most people don't even realize it's there. While he's introducing readers to Jesus, he says this, "Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way." Where does that come from? A lot of scholars will say Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. And that's kind of true, but what they don't say is Malachi was just quoting an older passage, Exodus 23, verse 20. It's the passage we looked at in the last video about the angel of the Lord leading the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan. So why do you think Mark wants you to connect the angel who led the Exodus and the conquest with Jesus? Might that be his way of saying that Jesus is the angel of the Lord? It seems Mark is doing the same thing Jude did. He's linking these two characters. He's just going about it in a more subtle way. Now, some people understandably will be uncomfortable with that. They'll ask, well, why wasn't Mark more direct about this? And I get that. Why hide these important statements about Jesus? That's the thing, though. These statements were not hidden to the original audience. They just seem to be hidden to you and I today because we don't have the Old Testament memorized like the Jews did. They would have caught on to this right away, but because we're living in a much different culture and time period with a much different way of seeing the world, well, Mark's intended message seems to be hidden to us today. In its day, though, Mark chapter 1, verse 2 probably stuck out like a sore thumb, and it probably got Mark in some trouble too, to be honest. But maybe you're not feeling very confident in this interpretation. What can we do? Let's see if any other New Testament authors made similar claims. Did anyone else link the angel of the Lord to Jesus? Because if we had some more evidence, then maybe we could start to feel a little more sure about this idea. How about John? In John chapter 1, verses 1 through 2, he calls Jesus the Word. He'll go on to say, the Word became flesh and lived among us. Many scholars think John just made this idea up. He just exaggerated who Jesus was. But this really wasn't a new idea at all. It's actually from the Old Testament. Another passage about the mysterious angel of the Lord. It's a bit tricky to find though because, well, he's not called the angel of the Lord in this passage that we're going to look at. But you don't need to see that title there to know that it's God being portrayed in the form of a man. Jeremiah chapter 1 verse 4 says the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. But if you keep reading this passage, you'll see from the context that the word doesn't describe speech or thought. God seems to have actually shown up to talk to Jeremiah in human form again, just like what we saw him do with Abraham. The Hebrew word used for the phrase the word can also mean something like an experience or a matter. And you'll notice that God has a hand. He reaches out and he touches Jeremiah's mouth. When this passage says the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, it seems to actually mean God actually came to visit Jeremiah in the form of a man. The phrase the word refers to God himself. So John just takes this idea and he applies it to Jesus. He calls Jesus the Word. Now that's nothing new. He's equating the angel of the Lord with Jesus just like Mark and Jude did. One more example from Paul is even more direct. Numbers chapter 21, verses 6 through 9 say that during the conquest of Canaan, some of the Israelites started to turn on God. They put God to the test, and as a response, the passage says, the Lord sent fiery serpents to kill them. Now keep that in your mind for a second. Now let's take a look at 1 Corinthians 10, verse 9. Paul retells that same story here, saying the Israelites put Jesus to the test. Do you see what Paul did here? Numbers says the Lord sent snakes. Paul says Jesus sent snakes. So which is it? The answer is yes, both. To Paul, they're the same being. Jesus is God. A few verses earlier in chapter 10, verse 4, Paul says Jesus was with them as they wandered through the wilderness. Wasn't the angel with them as they wandered through the wilderness? There are more and more passages like this, but I think you get the idea. It seems multiple New Testament writers believed Jesus was the angel who led the Exodus and the conquest against the Nephilim. But what you probably really want to know is, was Jesus really running around with a sword? Well, I don't know. We don't have a ton of details, and it doesn't exactly clearly say that. We do know that he was called the commander of the Lord's army in Joshua 5. He had a drawn sword there too. We saw him with a sword in Numbers, and later we'll see the angel of the Lord strike down 185,000 Assyrians in 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 35. We know he led the Israelite army to the Nephilim and played a pivotal role in their demise. Exodus 32:34 is also interesting. It says, "My angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I will visit their sin upon them." It's enough to make you wonder. But exactly what those battles looked like, we don't really know. Did he just lead the Israelites there and let them take care of most of it? Maybe. We don't really know, but it is fascinating to think about. Some people struggle, though, to see Jesus this way, as a warrior. They say that doesn't look like the same Jesus that we see in the New Testament, who taught us to love our enemies and turn the other cheek. Now, this is actually a really good point. I think there's a way to reconcile this, though. Does this depiction really seem that different than the Jesus that we'll see later in Revelation, the last book of the Bible, called the rider on the white horse? From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God Almighty. There is some symbolism going on here, but I think the discrepancy could be explained this way. Jesus did teach us to love one another, even love our enemies, and that is exactly the job he modeled for us humans to follow. He taught that war is not the way forward for us. We're meant to live in a way that stops these cycles of violence and fighting. But Jesus' job? His job is defeating spiritual enemies that oppose humans. He promised he would personally deal with our non-human enemies that have harassed mankind for centuries, like fallen angels, Satan, evil itself. The case could be made that that's exactly what he's doing during the conquest of the Nephilim too. You can go back through my previous videos in this series and see that the Nephilim may not have exactly been fully human. They may have been a partially spiritual enemy. They're described as the children of fallen angels and human women. And if this is true, the battle that the angel of the Lord led against the Nephilim may just be a preview of the battle Jesus fights at the end of time in the book of Revelation. If you want to know more about that, the best book I've ever seen explaining Revelation is in the links in the video description. It's also by Dr. Michael Heiser, and he'll explain Revelation not using the news, not using current events, but by uncovering the Old Testament references and context hidden in Revelation. Many scholars do recognize the angel of the Lord as Jesus, but others say early Christians were just desperate to find Jesus in the Old Testament. I've given you some of the evidence though, so what do you say? Let me know in the comments. If you were to ask someone what demons are, they might say fallen angels or evil gods, but a person living in the biblical period would have said demons were something else, something that's been forgotten for 2,000 years. So what are they? Time to investigate. Demons do actually have an origin story. And no, they didn't come from your last family reunion. We both know you were thinking it. If you start looking in the Bible for a verse, origin, or definition of what a demon is, you'll soon realize that you can't find one. Now some will say, well, what about the serpent in the Garden of Eden who tempted Adam and Eve? And today we call Satan a demon. But technically, even Satan wasn't considered a demon in ancient Jewish thinking. Demons were a different type of being entirely, something that the writers of the Bible didn't see the need to define at the time, because the people they were originally writing to already knew what demons were. According to a research paper called "When Did Angels Become Demons?", when the Bible was translated into Greek, the classification of spiritual beings in the Bible became simplified. We began calling every evil spiritual being a demon. A simplified tradition isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's easier for people to understand. But me, I'm a curious creature. I want all the gory details. That's not gonna cut the mustard, Binky. So if demons aren't fallen angels, well, what are they? One day I was doing what any normal person does when they're bored, taking a quiz from Lexham Press called "How Much Do You Know About Demons in the Bible?" One question threw me for a loop. It asked, demons technically are blank. Seems pretty basic. What? Demons should not be equated with evil angels? What kind of weird gobbledygook is this? My entire life was based on a lie. Well, not my entire life, just my definition of demons, apparently. I had just stumbled into a very complicated investigation into a part of church tradition that I thought had been settled for 2,000 years. The quiz had a very strange definition of demons, too. So it says, technically, demons seem to be different from rebellious high-ranking angels. The Bible does not clearly address the origin of demons, but in Second Temple Jewish literature, they were believed to be, what? The disembodied spirits of dead Nephilim. Why haven't I heard this before? According to Lexham Press, the way the biblical authors understood demons was a little different from other ancient cultures. In classical Greek mythology, any kind of evil supernatural being could be referred to as a demon, including gods, goddesses, and evil spirits. Sound familiar? The modern view of demons seems closer to what Greeks believed than to ancient Jews. But what is the biblical view of demons, and where does it come from? It seems something I heard from one of my professors was at play here. Dr. Michael Heiser mentioned in a class that the early Christian church lost much of its Jewish background because the Jews had rejected Jesus. It was really Greek converts who carried the church forward. So some parts of Jewish tradition and context were forgotten for centuries. It wasn't until long after archaeologists discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls that some lost Jewish perspectives started to come to light again. Lexham Press said demons were the disembodied spirits of dead Nephilim. I recognize that phrase. It comes from one of the most controversial passages in the entire Bible. Maybe you should sit down for this part. The first passage about the Nephilim occurs right before the famous story of the Great Flood in Noah's Ark. And I already know what's hiding there. Weird stuff. So I'm just going to tell you that this isn't my theory. I'm going to tell you what scholars think so that you know I'm not making up what I'm about to share with you. Scholar Archie T. Wright has done some of the most in-depth research on this passage. His book, Origin of Demons, dug up every ancient manuscript he could find on the origin of demons, the best ancient resources we have. And he found that in the ancient world, many cultures shared the common belief that angels, sometimes called the sons of God in the Old Testament, had children with, get this, human women. Pretty weird. That's Genesis 6, 1 through 4. That's what it's about. The hybrid children of angels and humans were called the Nephilim. Excuse me, what are you doing? People are gonna think we're an idiot. Don't tell them that. What, it's in the Bible, it's fair game. There's a reason nobody talks about this part of the Bible. Well, don't you think they deserve to know? No. Well, if God can become human, why can't angels have hairy kids? Because it's weird, and nobody will watch our YouTube channel ever again. It's not that weird. They're only as tall as NBA players. All right, fine. If you want to talk about this, you're gonna have to make a video later explaining the metaphoric interpretation of the Nephilim, okay? Just to, balance out the channel. Okay, but it's got some holes in it. I'll be the judge of that. Yeah, I know it's weird. Angels crossed the species barrier with humans. I can't tell you for certain if this was supposed to be some kind of metaphor or not, but I can tell you based on historical writings, it seems ancient people took this part of the Bible literally. The Damascus document calls this event a breaching of the cosmos. People ask how that's possible. If angels are spiritual beings, how would they produce children with human women? Very carefully. Passages like Genesis 18, verse 8, indicate that the angels were able to manifest physically at times and enjoy meals, eat meals with other people. There we see the three strangers who were actually angels eating food given to them by Abraham. It's not out of the question then that an angel could manifest physically and have a baby with a human being. I mean, I don't make the rules. I'm just saying there's room for it. The next question is, if they believed an angel could have a baby with a human, well, what kind of being was produced? Godzilla, NBA players, Richard Nixon. You don't have to look very far to see an example. A couple verses indicate that Goliath is a descendant of the Nephilim. They're giant warriors. The other Jewish writings we found, like the stuff in the famous Dead Sea Scrolls, seem to indicate they were somewhere between 7 and 9 feet tall. Egyptians claimed to have seen them in Canaan too. Origin of Evil Spirits mentions similar giants in Hesiod's Greek catalog of women. Gilgamesh from the Sumerian and Babylonian stories was also said to be very tall and 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. When everyone starts telling the same story, it makes you wonder if there's some bit of truth to it. But here's where the Bible starts to deviate from the other sources about these hybrid beings. In other ancient stories, the children produced by the angels could be good or bad. In Greek mythology, Zeus produced both good and bad children with human women. Hercules was one of his most heroic sons. But in the Bible, the children of the angels and women were pure evil. Why though? Well, this is interesting. Jews saw God as the creator of all life. But when the angels made the giants, well, basically they cut God out of the process. They tried to make life without him. In the Book of Watchers, part of 1st Enoch, we find a record of what people believed during that time period, that the Nephilim giants had no soul. Wait, what? Rather than being soul, spirit, and flesh, they were believed to be only spirit and flesh. So you're telling me that to them, a soul is not the same thing as a spirit? Without a soul, the Nephilim giants were excessively violent. They're even described as cannibals. How ironic that in the Bible's flood story, the earth needed to be destroyed because of excessive violence. The two stories almost fit together. Almost. So if a demon is defined as a disembodied spirit of a Nephilim giant, a creature with no soul, well, how does their spirit get disembodied in the first place? The Aramaic version of Enoch says the Nephilim giants conspired to devour men. They were so violent that if they were left alive, humans would have become extinct. So what does God do? He sent a flood to take the giants and the violent portion of humanity out, saving the future of the human race through Noah. This version of the flood story occurs outside of the Bible, over in Enoch, but think about it. The writer of the Bible's flood story brought up the Nephilim in their origin in the intro to the flood story. He assumed readers already knew that story from Enoch, so he brought it up, but didn't feel the need to retell the whole thing here. He wanted readers to think of it for some reason. But what happens when a half-divine being dies? The flood killed the body of the giants, but if they don't have a soul, then, well, what happens to their angelic spirit? According to the Book of Watchers, the spirit of the dead giants were not allowed to enter heaven or the realm of the dead. Instead, they were trapped in between worlds, roaming the earth. Have you ever wondered why evil spirits possessed people in the New Testament? 1 Enoch chapter 15 verse 11 says, "And the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth, and cause trouble. They take no food, but nevertheless hunger, and thirst, and cause offenses. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of men and against the women because they have proceeded from them." Well, that's pretty gnarly. In ancient Jewish thinking, since these spirits used to have a body but lost it, they wander the earth in search of a new body. And this would explain why Jesus was performing exorcisms in the New Testament, and why the possessed people were so strong and violent. Think about it. There are people in the New Testament who cannot be restrained even with chains. We're talking supernatural strength here, like a Marvel character. It seems to go beyond mental illness. They've become a host to something inhuman that can actually override normal human limits, almost like a drug. It turns out this view wasn't just some weird side story from extra-biblical sources. It's true that we find most of the details in extra-biblical writings, but one New Testament writer quoted directly from the Book of Enoch, where this story originates. Can you guess who it is? It's Jude. And Peter tells the story of God punishing the angels who created the giants in his New Testament letters. So this proves even the early church was reading the tale of the giants and demons. It was part of their worldview. So exactly how many demons are out there? It depends on who you ask. And there's some disagreement about whether or not the giants could actually reproduce. Some sources suggest the giants were sterile. To be honest, I'm not sure how to reconcile that yet with Numbers 13:33, which lists the Anakim as descendants of the Nephilim. How do the giants have descendants if they're sterile? Yeah, I'm gonna have to shelve that investigation for another day. Let's just roll with the scholars for a second. The scholars in Origin of Demons think we're dealing with a fixed number of demons. They just disagree on how many demons we're dealing with. Alexander thinks this number is quite small, but Archie T. Wright thinks the number of demons could be quite large. Okay, this is a little bit weird, I know, and I don't know what you believe about this, but let's just entertain this theory for a second. According to these stories, demons were born in the Middle East, and the only way they could get to another continent is by possessing someone who travels overseas. It wouldn't be impossible, but it could explain why some countries don't hear a lot of possession stories. Like in America. It turns out Lexham Press may be right. Their definition of demons explains why demons possess people. They lost their body in the flood or in the conquest of Canaan. Sure, like any supernatural story, it can be hard to come to terms with. But should you choose to accept it, it has a lot of explanatory power. It better explains why it was necessary for God to send a flood to save mankind, why Israel goes on a conquest against the giants in Canaan, plus who Jesus is talking to when he's performing exorcisms. I think you're ready to graduate from Nephilim University. You know more about the giants in the Bible than most people ever thought was even written in there. So why stop there though? We uncovered this awesome character, the angel of the Lord, who's thought to be a manifestation of God himself, and possibly Jesus walking on the earth in the form of a spirit before he was even born. So let's find out more about that. Watch this video next.